The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A., and my guest today is James Perry. James Perry has an M.A. in Museum Studies with an emphasis on collections management and public history. He has served as Curator of Collections and Exhibits for the Valdez Museum and Historical Archive in Valdez, Alaska, as well as the Museum of the Aleutians in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. Locally, he has served as consultant to various organizations for special project initiatives, including the City of Carmel by the Sea, the Royal Presidio Chapel and Missions Carmel, San Juan Bautista, Soledad, and San Antonio de Padua. He has served the Monterey County Historical Society in various capacities since 1990, and he is currently the Executive Director of the Historical Society. James Perry, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you for having me, Lynn.
Good to have you. And I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the Historical Society's campus. You have historic buildings and a lot of archives and other things going on at your campus. Could you tell us a little bit about what facilities you have and what visitors can see there?
Certainly, of course, but let me preface that the Monterey County Historical Society was founded in 19... So we're just turned 90, and our campus has been in our possession since 1972. 5-acre campus, and the very heart centerpiece of the campus is an amazing, it's built in 1844, 1845, so that was still the Mexican Republic era. Jose Eusebio Baranda constructed that home. It's built in the Monterey colonial architectural style, and between 1994 and 1998, I worked with an amazing group of women, the Colonial Dames of America, Monterey Bay chapter, and it took us 4 years to research and methodically recreate the interior exhibits reflecting an 1850s living history style. So that's the heart of our campus, again, 5 acres. But since then, we have brought over, restored several other buildings, including the 1897 Lagunita Schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse that John Steinbeck actually writes about in his book called The Red Pony. So that was actually scheduled to be demolished, and the Historical Society found out about a month prior to it being demolished. So we went ahead and relocated that schoolhouse to the campus, and it underwent a 2-year full-scale restoration. So a few years passed, and in 1990, we saved another structure from nearly being demolished. It's a beautiful Queen Anne Victorian from 1898 that was designed by William Weeks, who was an immigrant here, came to us from Prince Edward Island, Canada, and he is really still considered to be one of the most preeminent architects of the time period, latter part of the 19th century into the 20th century, because he was one of the very few architects who could transition successfully in Victorian architecture in all of its various eclectic forms, then to mission revival, arts and crafts, and then finally into Mediterranean revival. So that is a project that is ongoing. I also should insert the fact that even though we are called the Monterey County Historical Society, we are a private foundation that does not receive any local, state, or federal funding. So we're a membership-based institution which relies solely on the generosity of our donors, whether they give their time, their talent, or funding. So that's important for me to note. Additionally, we have it's a Filipino labor bunkhouse that was constructed in 1930. And again, that is the last surviving structure, which was once upon a time part of a much larger labor camp. And it's important for us to highlight this building, and the reason why is the fact that we can educate the general public with regard to the agricultural labor movement, which commenced in the 1930s with the Filipino American community, and then ultimately that process was continued on by Cesar Chavez. So that's also very important. And we have a 12,500 square foot building, which will be our future museum as we continue to build that out. But resident within that structure is an archaeological repository, 2 archival vaults, and our beautiful Victorian library that we just dedicated, as a matter of fact, on May the 18th. And so the library itself is quite a wonder. You know, the idea is to time travel our visitors back to the 1880s. So long ago, I had a vision of creating a space where we forced time to stop. And I do believe we accomplished our goal. So there's that. And, we have plans for additional projects. For example, a 2,200 square foot building dedicated to the first peoples of the region, celebrating 13,000 years of human occupation in the region. And, also, it's very important to note that surrounded, we'll have 22,000 square feet of botanical gardens which celebrate the ethnobotany of the region as it pertains to the long-standing traditions of using plants for medicine, as it were.
Yeah.
So, yes, there's quite a bit going on.
There is. I was reading a little bit about the botanical garden, and I understand it's only been worked on now for just a few years.
Yes.
So you obviously got plans to expand all that, but it sounds like you'll have heirloom plants from the region, and as you mentioned just now, that are some of those plants are going to be reflective of native food and medicine plants that the native people used?
Precisely. And we are sourcing fruit and vegetable stock dating all the way back to the 1770s, as a matter of fact. Yes.
Wow. Great. That's great. Monterey served as the state capital of Alta California under Spanish and Mexican rule. And the historical district of Monterey is still full of historical buildings. Does the Historical Society have any involvement in preserving that heritage there in Monterey?
So long ago, we took the initiative to public outreach, and what that is, or outreach to other institutions. So as the Monterey County Historical Society, one of our principal missions is to be a servant to all other cultural and historical institutions in the region. So we've been doing our very best to try to encourage collaborative partnerships among all of these various different entities. Yes, and to that end, for the first time, I had long ago a vision of creating a program to where the Historical Society could serve as a meeting place, as it were, to bring as many cultural and historical institutions as we could together as a family in hopes to inspire people getting to know each other, people developing collaborative relationships and partnerships. So, and that's working. I commenced that program in 2014, and specifically during our annual barbecue, which we have in September, bringing all of these various cultural and historical groups together during the barbecue. So again, those who attend the barbecue can be educated by various different cultural and historical entities with regard to their mission, their plans, what they're doing. And, again, the idea is to get everyone on the same page talking together. So unfortunately, I should say, historically, many of these groups really have, in some way, shape, or form, not to sound disparaging, but it's a historical reality, the fact that you had a lot of these groups operating independently of each other and really not sharing what they're doing. So, again, communication is everything. There's an old-fashioned term that I truly embrace, and that is, particularly in the future, is, we flourish together or we die alone.
Yeah, and it does seem like that. Partitioning of all these different organizations that might have an interest or a holding in history has been part of our history, not just in this part of California, but throughout the nation. And it seems like that might be changing, and perhaps Monterey County Historical Society is really part of that change.
We would like to think so. And, again, I'm constantly assessing, what we've done and also what we have yet to do. And, there are so many opportunities moving forth into the future. And again, so through time, just to give you an idea, the Monterey County Historical Society helped to establish the Carmel Valley Historical Society, the Soledad Historical Society, which is located in the Salinas Valley, and is also helping to establish the Greenfield Historical Society. But again, through time, through the decades, I have had the privilege in being of counsel to various groups, whether it's the identification of historical materials, artifacts, being of counsel when it comes to preservation of objects and works on paper, art, and all of its various different mediums. Again, it's a grassroots effort. Like I said, we've been at it for 90 years. I presented myself as a volunteer the day after I turned 16 in 1990. And, in those days, I had the complete privilege of being educated by people who were already in their 80s and 90s in those days. So a lot of traditional knowledge that isn't necessarily even documented on paper. It's a lot of it is oral history. And one of the things that I am doing is writing these stories down, because if I don't, well, they'll just be lost to time.
Yeah. And you've been involved for such a long time. And as you mentioned, you recently celebrated the 90th anniversary of the Historical Society.
Yes.
And the Historical Society was also recently gifted with a photo and image collection of Mr. Pat Hathaway. Hathaway was raised in Pacific Grove and assembled one of California's largest privately held image collections. And before passing away suddenly in 2021, Pat managed to assemble over 80,000 historical images, I read, mostly of the Monterey Peninsula, Salinas Valley, and some other parts of California, dating all the way back to the 1850s. He also took over 470,000 of his own photographs over a period of about 5 decades, chronicling daily life on the Monterey Peninsula. And I understand his collection was gifted to the Historical Society just recently. I imagine cataloging and curating such a big collection is, well, at least time-consuming. What kinds of images did Pat Hathaway have in his collection, and are any of those photos on exhibit yet?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We have, so that's a two-part answer. So first, with regard to exhibition, we have loaned to several institutions various images for their exhibitions. Now, our museum per se is it's going to be a ways off, as it were, according to funding. Again, the more generous people can be, the sooner that we can actually have this museum finally finished. Now, we supply on a regular basis images from Mr. Hathaway's collection to authors, scholars, and so that's, at this point, that is how we're being able to again, be of service to other institutions, and again to the public and to scholars and educators. So the second, I should tell you, the collection itself, unfortunately, Mr. Hathaway, and I really don't want to go into detail because it's a little unfortunate, but despite my best efforts through over the last 3 decades, and other people's efforts trying to counsel him with regard to the development of finding aids for the collection. He was always so busy collecting historical imagery, putting together a magnificent collection of ephemera, and creating an amazing library, as a matter of fact, that he didn't create that finding aid. And so we are navigating through the collection. Again, it is the breadth and the depth of the collection itself is staggering. And I might add that the Historical Society worked very hard to assure that Mr. Hathaway's collection remained resident in our county, because it was a distinct possibility that collection could have ended up in Southern California at a few repositories that I will not mention. But I myself took this very personally to make sure that Hathaway's collection remained resident in our county, because I first met him in 1986 when I was 12, and he was one of the, I don't think I'd be speaking with you right now were it not for Hathaway, who encouraged me to stay the course for decades, to stay the course as a historian, as a servant of history. So I think, again, we here, the historical community, I should say, would have been haunted had his collection left our county. So it was very gratifying to make sure that, that his collection remained. And, obviously there are decades of work that needs to be done in order to, truly make the collection accessible. And I made a promise to the public to make sure that at some point the entire collection will be accessible to the general public. But it's going to take time. These kinds of things, in order to curate any collection properly, how small or grand it might be, it takes a considerable amount of time. So, yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. And without having it already organized in some kind of coherent manner. That's an enormous task.
It is. But, again, it's a labor of love. So one of the things that troubles me, though, is in the youth, we're not really seeing a lot of younger people who are wanting to go into the museum field or nonprofit field. And one of the principal reasons is that, let me just put it to you this way, Len. We don't, being a historian, you don't do it for money. I can guarantee you that. And
yes.
A lot of young people find that unacceptable. So I think to myself, when am I going to finally find a successor? See, now I'm no spring chicken, not anymore, but I should say, I'd better hang on for a great deal longer, because it's not getting any easier in the nonprofit world. Not at all.
No, indeed. I recognize that. And both my brother and I have a nephew who are historians. And it's interesting to see how that has changed. And I'd like to come back to that topic. But first, for any listeners who may have just tuned in, my guest is James Perry. He is the executive director of the Monterey County Historical Society. And we've just been really kind of going over what the Historical Society has been up to lately and what their facilities are. If you want to find out more and you're in a hurry, you can look at their website, mchsmuseum.com, and there is a whole lot of wonderful information there, including information about their hours and where they're located if you'd like to visit the facilities that they maintain. But I want to come back to this, James. You mentioned, it's a nonprofit organization. It is not paid for by local government or anything else. I assume, being an executive director, that you are a paid employee. But I wanted to ask, do you have very many paid staff, and do you depend much on volunteers?
I am the only staff member. I'm executive director, curator, archivist. And, again, as I said, it is very much a labor of love. I enjoy and I'm grateful to have a small but very, very dedicated family, as it were, of volunteers. And one very special thing about the Historical Society is once people start volunteering, the Historical Society tends to hold on to people, as it were, for a very long time. Just because, again, it's the environment, it's a labor of love, it's working together to really, truly understand and visually see the progress and, embrace the impacts that, history and all of the lessons that it teaches can really cause us to take pause and reflect on where we've been and where we're going.
Yeah, indeed. The perspective of history is, in my mind, extremely valuable. I happen to love it. I don't have a degree in it, but I study it a lot on my own since the days when I was a student. But I have to admit that I didn't really gain that interest in school. I found most of the history I was taught in public school and the little bit I did in college to be very dry and difficult for me to see the relevance of. And yet it seems that we actually can learn an enormous amount from history, but it depends on whether we're exposed to its real dynamics and the personal experiences of those involved. Like, it makes a difference if you can relate to the stories coming from history. How do you get young people interested and motivated to learn about the history of where they live or their own history?
Well, see, that, every individual is different. Some are more tactile than others. Some are more, some are visual. In order to teach history properly, it's a very personal one-on-one. No size fits all. And, again, to be able to impart that history to where it's inspirational, it's compelling, it's very, very specialized. And, again, I think that our state curriculum really needs a very huge overhaul. Again, redesigning the state curriculum with regard to not only the history that's imparted, but again, what lessons are we really trying to teach? What do we really want to convey? See? So there needs to be more discussions, I think, not only with regard to imparting a general history of California, but every single region, every single town, has, its own special set of historical circumstances through time in order to truly understand where they are presently, because it's a cumulative experience through time, circumstances that has led any given community into the present of particularly challenges that they're facing these days. So there really needs to be, I think, more community discussions with regard to how our youth are being educated in history.
And I imagine you have some thoughts about that. If you were to suggest a framework for how we teach history or what we include in the history that we do teach, are there particular areas of emphasis or way of approaches that you think would be valuable?
I think the immigration experience is very central that people need to understand, because truly in California we are very much a state of immigrants, and the historical patterns of migration to California by all of its various cultural groups through time has allowed California to be I guess I'm biased, but I should say I think our state is the greatest state in the nation. Some might beg to differ with me, but as a historian, when you look at the past of California, and imagine if California was a culturally homogeneous place, bereft of all of the various rich contributions in art, poetry, science, music, coming to us as a result of immigrants coming here. You see? So I think, and particularly, that really does segue into what California continues to face with regard to immigration and looking at immigration in California.
Yeah, and migration has been part of the human experience for at least tens of thousands of years. And particularly here, and I appreciate your emphasis in California because it's so recent here. I mean, even compared to the eastern United States, our immigration has been so recent to here, and it's quite profound. And I'm always entranced, really, to see how that has changed just in the course of my life. I was born in the 50s. When I go revisit the areas of Southern California where I grew up, or I visit other parts of the Greater Bay Area where there's a lot more diversity of immigrant population, and it's to me is striking what a unique chemistry that creates to have such diversity of cultures, and it's reflected in, as you said, in everything: our art, science, music, our food, and that's profoundly interesting. We're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with more with James Perry, the executive director of the Monterey County Historical Society, right after this. If you're just joining us, my guest is James Perry. He has a master's degree in museum studies, and he is currently the executive director of the Monterey County Historical Society. And James, I wanted to come back to a little bit about where we are. Apparently, since you're in Monterey County, the name Monterey, I understand, was given to the area that we now know as the city of Monterey by Vizcaíno when he was sailing by in 1602, naming it for the Count of Monterey, who was then the Viceroy of New Spain. In other words, all of Spain's colonial holdings here in the Western Hemisphere. That name was extended to the whole county in 1850 as California was incorporating and getting organized. Most of the place names that preceded the Spanish colonization are not now known. And I wondered if there's anything going on in terms of trying to recover what we do know about those place names, and if there are a few that you know of that stand out.
Yes, particularly one in particular, and the tribal chair of the Esselen Nation, located down in Big Sur, is Tom Little Bear Nason. And Tom has been doing amazing work as far as the acquisition of tribal lands that they had called their own for, again, 13,000 years. And they've been acquiring lands. Now, most recently, upon one of these parcels, the Rana Creek Ranch, former Rana Creek Ranch, they will have a cultural heritage center. So that's in the works. Long time coming. And, I'm very grateful to report that project is gaining a lot of momentum. So that's very important. There are other tribal groups throughout the region, and with different plans. I'm presently as far as trying to convey who's doing what. That's kind of difficult for me to. Otherwise, I could go in. Well, that could be a whole other segment.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's I know here in Santa Cruz County where our studios are located, the Amamutsan tribal band has been very active in trying to get native stewardship practices for the land integrated into management of public spaces, parks in particular, and they've also been very active in helping to document the history of the peoples who lived in this area and helping to regenerate the language, the Mutsun language, which was almost narrowly escaped being lost. And there are other languages in this region that were in fact lost, but it's amazing to see how much they've been able to do without being a federally recognized tribe. And I know that's true for the Esselen as well, and also for the people that we generally refer to as the Salinan Indians. I know that's not their own name for their own people, but people who resided in much of what's now Salinas Valley and the hills and valleys leading into it along the tributary rivers. Do you see has this been a change? I mean, you've been in the museum work for a long time, and you're a historian. Do you see a change here in how we gather that information and present it regarding the native peoples that preceded colonization?
What I think should happen, and it hasn't yet, but what I think should happen is that our various tribal groups throughout the region really need to come together to the table as a family and have these kinds of discussions. Again, it's all about everyone being on the same page. Not one group can do everything. And so this is where, everyone really needs to toe their portion of the line with respect to, again, sharing the history of their experience, so our youth can appreciate their contributions through time, throughout 13,000 years.
Yeah, which for most of us is an almost incomprehensible amount of time, especially given in my own personal case how little record there is of my own family's lineage. I'm lucky if I can trace it back 150 years. Historical preservation is a challenge in many communities. Are there projects or development plans in Monterey County that might jeopardize significant historical places or buildings there?
Oh, well, I could cite numerous haunting case studies of lost opportunities, demolition by neglect, still a few projects that, I don't want to be incendiary, but there are things. It's so, the old adage, it's not only what one does, it's what one fails to do. Okay?
Yes.
So every community here in this county and unincorporated Monterey County, which comprises of mostly the substantial portion of our county, there are challenges, and the challenges abound. And again, what will create momentum for historical preservation is communication, people getting together, having these open general conversations. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to lose more because we have already lost so much.
Yeah, and having grown up in Los Angeles, where it was standard practice to simply pave over whatever had been there before, I can relate. We tend to take so for granted our current state of things without a sense of how it got to be the way it is, or what the origins of what we have are. Do you see an opportunity there? I mean, as you have people come and visit your facilities and people come and make use of the archival information that you have stored, do you see that perspective kind of making its way into a broader awareness of the general public?
I do. Slowly, it's happening, but it's happening at a snail's pace, in my humble opinion. So, as far as I wanted to direct your attention, and perhaps you may even have caught the very tail end of the urban renewal era. So here in this region, our urban renewal program ramped up in the 50s and even lasted until the mid 80s, as a matter of fact. During that time, Monterey, for example, all of that portion of what is now Lower Alvarado Street, the corner of Franklin and Alvarado Street south, all the way down to Custom House Plaza, that was a business district known as Lower Alvarado Business District. So comprising of, various enterprises, but all of that was taken out during that urban renewal era. So there was a paradigm shift with regard to thoughts about historical preservation during that time period, and unfortunately, during that time period, the thought was pervasive: off with the old and in with the new. See, and again, I think the future of historical preservation, or at least in this county, can be actually looking back at what we did, not me, but what was done in the 50s and 60s, which ultimately saw the destruction of countless residential and commercial properties throughout this county. Is a haunting case study of, again, what shouldn't have been done, what we should not do moving forward into the future. And, I think when it comes to historical preservation, there are so many amazing associations in our region, including the Alliance of Monterey Area Preservationists. So this is a group that's particularly concerned with demolition by neglect, as it were, of historical, residential, and commercial. So, again, I think when it comes to historical preservation and how we have treated it in the past, how we're treating it now, I think that there's much more awareness, I think, than there used to be, say, 30 years ago. Yes.
That's encouraging, and it's interesting. I've had a number of guests on this program talking about urban development patterns and land use, and what's become very clear from both my own education as a planner, something I did for about 3 years of my career, and from these conversations, is that what we had historically in terms of landforms that preceded, particularly anything that preceded World War II, was something that facilitated easy access to goods and services, easy mobility without depending on a lot of motorized transportation, and a scale of buildings that was relatively inexpensive to maintain. And we seem to have lost that with, particularly the very high infrastructure costs associated with the glories of redevelopment. But redevelopment itself, of course, that process, there were a bunch of players in that realm, and that itself is a piece of history here in the United States of, the movers and shakers who helped to make the sort of post-war development boom really go, which, as you said, continued right up, in a sense, right up to the present, but not quite with as much fever, perhaps, as it did up until, the 1990s. And that itself is a piece of history. And I wondered, as a historical society, do you make it maybe beyond what's possible or practical, especially with given staffing, but do you make any attempt to try to document that more recent history?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. Positively. Yes.
And what does that look like?
Well, again, it's visual documentation. It's also documenting sites that, unfortunately, for one reason or another, are not spared from the wrecking ball. Okay? So one does what one can with regard to documenting, visually documenting, as well as a historiography of any given historical site. thereof, as it, before it comes down, as it were. So fortunately, we're not seeing these kinds of things happen in the frequency that we did 35 years ago. And I could cite several examples, but again, that would be a whole entire additional segment.
Well, we may have to get back to that. You mentioned you didn't want to say anything too inflammatory, but this is community radio. It does happen quite often. But maybe perhaps not consistent with the mission of the Historical Society. Much of Monterey County is agricultural land, and agriculture has played a huge role in the history of the region. What are some of the ways that agriculture has influenced the development and the character of the area?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll preface the question by letting you know that the north part of the Salinas Valley, where the Historical Society is located, it once was the appearance of that part of the Salinas Valley, the ecology, looked very much like Elkhorn Slough and Moss Landing, lakes, waterways, sloughs, ponds, up until the commencement of the agricultural land reclamation projects, commencing in the 1870s. So thereby filling in the sloughs, the lakes, the ponds, which sustained a huge population of waterfowl, tule, elk, and of course the principal quadruped of the region, the grizzly bear. So once all of that land was, again, the ecology was completely altered to create land for dry land farming, wheat, grain, and also create additional land for cattle grazing. So that set the stage for, once the ecology was altered, there really was no going back. So that's the preface. Now, moving forward with regard to how agriculture has dictated, as it were, expansion of our various cities and unincorporated parts of Monterey County, it does dominate. It very much dominates. And while it is clearly understood that additional housing is needed, then there comes the question, well, what about the water? So, for example, in parts of the Salinas Valley, it's actually sinking. The land is subsiding, as it were, because the aquifers are being drained. They're being exhausted. So what does that mean for future growth? Well, it's anyone's guess. I mean, again, we need it, particularly for our essential workers who put their lives at risk coming up here to put food on our tables. They're not fed properly as far as I'm concerned. I won't go into that. I don't think they're treated as well as they should be. They need to be honored. And, they need to have better living conditions, better working conditions, in my opinion. And I'm not alone on this. I think a lot of people feel precisely the same way. So what do you do? What does one do? Again, this is where, community dialogue really needs to take place. We need to have these conversations. And a lot of these conversations are uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of people to have. But in order to move forward, particularly as good human beings, we need to have these kinds of conversations, how uncomfortable they might seem.
Yeah, that's always a challenge. But I appreciate that you mentioned that. You referred earlier to migratory farm workers, as early as the 1920s and 30s, playing a huge role in the economy of particularly Salinas Valley, but the whole region. And then the United Farm Workers Union, when it first began to organize, it had an early presence in the Salinas Valley. And that's influenced some of the culture of the area and also approaches to housing and recruitment of farm workers. I imagine that there's some historical records around all of that. Has the Monterey County Historical Society been able to collect any of the historical accounts of farm workers in the county?
Some, yes. Oral histories, written histories, and there was a group called, and they are, it's called the People's Oral History Project, and they put out an amazing book titled Voices of Change, and this particular book is a collection of written narratives or oral histories that were transcribed into written narratives talking about the immigrant experience, the experience of the conditions in the fields, the politics of changing those difficult circumstances into something somewhat tenable. But, again, agriculture has a long way to go when it comes to, truly, again, at the end of all things, it's a human issue. And I think that there are several of our ag firms that, they embrace this, and several of them are doing excellent work when it comes to developing new housing, communities, for our essential workers who come here for the ag deal to put food on our tables.
Well, we have just about 5 minutes left, and the Monterey County Historical Society recently celebrated its 90th anniversary, just this past December, I believe. And you've been involved with the society for over 30 years. And I wondered, in that time, has the focus of the society changed, and are public expectations and reception of historical information changing?
Well, as we continue to evolve and develop and mature, because even though we're 90 years old, that's still young. In the grand scheme of things, when you think about it.
Yes.
So as far as being more prolific with regard to delivery of services, content, project-based development, community development, being of counsel to other institutions, most certainly. When it comes to all of the aforementioned, we're definitely thriving that way. And it'll just continue to become better, very much so.
Well, that's really encouraging, and I'm fascinated to learn about what you're doing. Being a resident of Santa Cruz, I am reluctant to deal with the traffic to get myself to Salinas, but after our conversation, I am eager to visit your campus in Salinas and learn a little bit more about what you're up to. So I want to ask you at this point to please share with our listeners how they can find out more and where you're located.
Certainly. So our website, which is newly redesigned, it's a respectable start, I might add, which so much more content needs to be placed upon it. But like I said, it's a respectable start. It is mchsmuseum.com, and our hours of operation are Mondays through Saturdays from 9 a.m. to noon and 1 to 3 p.m. And we're located at 333 Baranda Road, 1 mile off Highway 101.
All right, that's pretty close at hand. James Perry, it's been a pleasure, and we definitely could be going into much greater detail about some of these subjects. So I would look forward to having you back in the future. And in the meantime, if there's anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we move on to our first-person singular commentary here, please go ahead.
Well, our mantra of the Historical Society, there was a statement that was made in December of 1933 that caused a stir among those attending a private party the day after Christmas, the day 26th of December 1933, which caused actually the Historical Society to come into existence. Someone said, "History is fragile, memories fade. Historians often serve best preserving yesterday today, for often tomorrow is too late."
Well, thank you very much, James Perry, and thank you for being on the program, and look forward to having you back in the future.